All right, this is the study guide review for Unit 2.4, and we're going to start with the special right triangles, and you should be able to do all of these problems with no calculator. You will not have a calculator on the test. So for number one, we want to ask ourselves, are these 30, 60, 90 or 45, 45, 90 because they're mixed? So I can see that this is isosceles because that mark means they're congruent. So I know that's my 45, 45, 90 if it's isosceles, right? So I know that x and 7 must be the same. And then I also know that that relationship is that if I know my leg, I multiply it by the square root of 2 to get the hypotenuse. So 7 times the square root of 2, or 7 root 2. Number 2, we've got a 30, 60, 90. If it helps, you can fill in another angle. We're given the short leg. Remember, the short leg is always opposite the smallest angle. So if our short leg is 5, we know to get the long leg, we're going to multiply that by the square root of 3. To get the hypotenuse, we're going to go back to our short leg and double it. So for C, we end up getting 10. 5 times 2 is 10. And for our long leg, we just write that as 5 root 3. All right, number 3. Number 3 is another 30, 60, 90. We can identify it by the angles we're given. We are given the hypotenuse. So we always want to go to the short leg. So if my hypotenuse is 20, I divide that by 2 to get my short leg, and then multiply my short leg 10 by the square root of 3. So for A, we have 10. For B, we have 10 times the square root of 3. All right, number 4. Now we have another 45, 45, 90, or isosceles right. And what I'm looking for to identify that is I see that these angles are congruent. So remember, anytime you have a triangle whose base angles are congruent, it must be isosceles. All right, so, sorry, I had to touch my phone for a second. So if we're given the hypotenuse, because it's opposite the 90-degree angle, the hypotenuse is 2 root 2, so we just divide that by the square root of 2. And that's going to give us 2 for both of the legs. So x and y are both 2. Number 5, another 45, 45, 90. We're given one of the legs, and we know that the legs are the same. So if I'm given one leg is 6 root 2, the other leg is 6 root 2. Don't be fooled when you see the root 2 in the leg. That can happen. So don't see that root 2 and assume that that's a hypotenuse. Now to find y, and this is where people start to get confused, but the math doesn't change. We're going to take the leg and multiply it by the square root of 2. So y is 6 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 2. Now, if you remember what we've been reviewing from Algebra 1, when you multiply the square root of 2 times itself, you just get 2. You can do the intermediate step and say 6 times the square root of 4, but remember the square root of 4 is still just 2. So this becomes 6 times 2, and we end up getting 12. So our hypotenuse is 12. All right, in number 6, you are given the long leg. And I can tell that because it's a 30, 60, 90, and I'm given the leg that is opposite the 60-degree angle. So if my long leg is 8 root 3, I can divide my long leg by the square root of 3 to get my short leg of 8. And then I'm going to double that to get my hypotenuse of 16. All right, moving on. Number 7. Number 7, another 30, 60, 90. I'm given the long leg, and this time the long leg is not a multiple of the square root of 3. So don't be fooled by this. You still do the same thing. We're going to take the long leg, and we're going to divide it by the square root of 3 to get the short leg. So the first way I might write this is 16 divided by the square root of 3. That's enough to get you partial credit. If this were like a test question or a quiz question, I'd give you partial credit for that. But we want to rationalize our denominator. So we're going to multiply by the square root of 3 over the square root of 3, which we know is just the number 1. That gives us 16 times the square root of 3 on top. And the square root of 3 times itself is just the number 3. If you want to do that step where you get the square root of 9 and then simplify it, you can. Now, if you look at this, in this case, 16 is not divisible by 3. So I can't simplify this further. So 16 root 3 over 3 That's going to be our final answer for A. So the short leg of this triangle is 16 root 3 over 3. All right, when we go to find the hypotenuse, we still just multiply that number by 2. So 16 root 3 over 3 times 2. Since 16 root 3 over 3 is a fraction, we want to multiply it by 2 over 1. And all that's going to do is double the 16. So we'll end up getting 32 times the square root of 3 over 3 for that hypotenuse. All right, number 8, another 30, 60, 90. All right, so if we're given the long leg is 13, this is actually a lot like that one we just did. Man, these are tough. It's good to practice. That's probably why I put 2 of them on there, because they're hard problems. So I'm giving you the long leg. And again, we've got to go to the short leg. You don't want to try to go long to hypotenuse. So I'm going to take 13 and divide that by the square root of 3. And again, even though this answer is mathematically correct, the algebra teacher in me does not like to see that radical under the fraction bar. So we're just going to rationalize this. So we'll get 13 root 3 on top, and again, divided by the square root of 3. And this is another example of when we really can't simplify that because 13 is not divisible by 3. If we ended up with something like 15 root 3 over 3, we would divide 15 by 3. Okay, so that's our short leg, 13 root 3 over 3. Double it to get the hypotenuse. So again, just like in number 7, effectively just that 13 is going to double. So we'll get 26 root 3 over 3. Because when you multiply, you're doubling the top, and 13 root 3 is bound with multiplication. So you only double one number. All right, hopefully those are the 2 hardest problems, but I don't know, we're not done yet. Number 9, 45, 45, 90. We're given the hypotenuse, so we know that x and y are equal if they're both the legs. Remember, if you're given the hypotenuse, you divide by the square root of 2. So 18 divided by the square root of 2, that becomes 18 divided by the square root of 2 times root 2 over root 2 to rationalize this. We get 18 root 2 over 2. This is an example of when we can simplify. 18 is divisible by 2. This becomes 9 root 2. So both x and y equal 9 root 2. All right, last row. Number 10, we are given the long leg of a 30, 60, 90, but thank goodness it's in an easier form. So if our long leg is 15 times the square root of 3, we want to divide off the square root of 3 to get 15 for A, and double it to get 30 for our hypotenuse C. Number 11, a 45, 45, 90. All right, so if I know one leg, I know the other. So x is one of my legs. If one leg is 32 root 2, so is x. All right, so those are our 2 congruent sides. And then y, our hypotenuse, we have to get this by multiplying this leg by the square root of 2. So if I take 32 root 2 and multiply that by the square root of 2, that becomes 32 times the square root of 4, or just 32 times 2. And that gives us 64. So our hypotenuse is 64. Last problem, number 12. We are given the hypotenuse of a 30, 60, 90. And so we want to take the hypotenuse and find the short leg. So remember, we just divide the hypotenuse by 2 to get the short leg. And I can simplify 30 root 3 over 2. This just becomes 15 root 3. So A is 15 times the square root of 3. Then remember, to get from A to B, we have to multiply by the square root of 3. So that's just going to be 15 root 3 times the square root of 3, which is the same as saying 15 times the square root of 9, or just 15 times 3. 15 times 3 is 45. So our long leg of that 30, 60, 90 is 45. You made it through the first page of the study guide.